If you speak to anyone who lived through the 1950s, one detail comes up again and again. Cold winters were harsher, homes were less comfortable by modern standards, yet folks often slept warmer and more consistently through the night. This wasn't nostalgia or selective memory, it was the result of practical systems, habits, and materials that modern living quietly abandoned. Understanding how people managed warmth then isn't about romanticizing hardship, it's about learning techniques that worked under real constraints, techniques that remain useful today for anyone interested in resilience, energy independence, or seasonal living. Bedroom design in the 1950s prioritized heat retention rather than airflow. Mid-century bedrooms were smaller, lower-ceilinged, and deliberately enclosed. Large, open bedrooms with multiple exterior walls were uncommon. Fewer windows meant fewer cold surfaces pulling heat out of the room overnight. Doors were kept closed, not for privacy, but to trap warmth. Heavy curtains were standard, not decorative, and often layered with linings designed to block drafts. Today's preference for open layouts and large windows works against nighttime warmth, especially in winter. This can be applied now by isolating sleeping spaces during cold seasons. Closing doors, blocking unused vents, and using thick window coverings can raise perceived warmth several degrees without touching the thermostat. The principle is simple containment, something earlier generations understood instinctively. In the 1950s, bedding followed the same logic as cold weather clothing layers that trapped air. Wool blankets, cotton sheets, and sometimes feather eiderdowns work together to create insulation rather than relying on a single heavy cover. Synthetic comforters today are often thick but poor at regulating moisture and airflow, leading to cold spots and night chills. Wool was especially important, you know. It kept in the heat even when it was damp and let moisture escape, so folks didn't get that clammy cold that wakes you up in the middle of the night. Most families actually used a bunch of thinner blankets instead of just one heavy one, which gave them more control over how warm they stayed. And honestly, this trick still works today. If you swap out a big, thick comforter for 2 or 3 lighter, breathable layers, especially if they're wool or cotton, you can keep your body temperature steadier all night, and you'll lose less heat from sweating or evaporation. Back in the 1950s, you hardly ever saw a bed pushed up against an outside wall, unless there just wasn't any other choice. Those cold walls would send a chill through you, especially as the night wore on and temperatures dropped. Instead, beds were usually set closer to inside walls or near whatever leftover heat might be coming from a chimney, even if the fireplace wasn't being used anymore. These days, folks tend to put their beds wherever looks best, not really thinking about how it affects warmth. But just moving your bed away from an outside wall or putting a solid headboard between you and that cold surface can really cut down on losing heat through radiation. And if you throw a thick rug under your bed, it'll help block out the cold that can sneak up from an uninsulated floor, something a lot of people forget about. So sleeping naked or, just lightly clothed is really a modern trend. Back in the 1950s, folks wore night clothes that were actually designed to keep in the warmth. Cotton flannel pajamas, wool socks, and even those light bed jackets were pretty common, especially during the colder months. This way, people didn't have to crank up the heat so much, and their bodies stayed warm without all that uncomfortable sweating. Honestly, this kind of approach still makes a lot of sense today, especially in households that are trying to save energy. Wearing breathable, insulating sleepwear helps keep your core temperature steady so you can keep the room a bit cooler without feeling uncomfortable. Plus, it means you're not relying so much on those heating systems that tend to dry out the air and mess with your sleep. Back then, hot water bottles were just part of everyday life, not something you grabbed only in an emergency. Folks would place them near their feet or along their torso and, they'd give off warmth for hours. But the real trick was how they'd use them to warm up the bedding itself before turning in for the night. That way, you didn't get that shock of cold sheets. Now, homes held on to heat differently too. Cast iron radiators, masonry chimneys, even solid wood furniture. They all acted as a thermal mass, slowly letting out stored heat as the night wore on. These days, with modern lightweight construction, houses just cool off mighty quick once the heat shuts off. Sometimes windows got cracked open for ventilation, but it wasn't random. It was done real briefly and with purpose. Folks would flush out cold air early in the evening, then seal everything up tight for the night ahead. Drafts? Well, they'd block those using door snakes, heavy drapes, or just rolling up towels and tucking them in where needed. In the 1950s, people tended to head to bed earlier during winter and sleep in a bit later. That wasn't just about habits, it was really about staying warm. Sleeping through the coldest hours took some planning, and waiting to wake up until the sun helped warm the house naturally. Bedding and clothing would shift with the seasons, not just stay the same all year long. The warmth folks enjoyed back in the 1950s, well, it came from thinking in systems. Heat was conserved, directed, and supported by daily habits. Nothing ever got wasted. Nothing was just assumed to be endless. And honestly, these ways are still mighty relevant. Whether you're worried about resilience, power outages, rising energy bills, or just want to sleep better when it's cold outside, you don't need a mid-century house to put these ideas to work. What you do need is some attention to materials, placement, layering, and a good routine. These are quiet skills, passed down through experience, not just written down in some manual. If you find this kind of practical, historical know-how important, go ahead and subscribe to Living Through the Seasons. Share this guide with anyone who appreciates real-world lessons from the past. These aren't just relics, they're tools, and they still work just fine.